Greetings, humans. You have entered the Command Zone, your destination for all aspects of Elder Dragon Highlander. Enjoy your stay.
Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to the Command Zone podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Weeks.
How's it? It's Josh Lee Kwai.
And today, we're doing it. We're going back and we're talking about the Commander deck building template. Commander decks are very hard to build. There's 100 cards and it's fun to be able to do it yourself. So today we're going to go through all of the things that you need to make a healthy Commander deck. Check all the boxes so when you build a deck, you can bring it and it'll play pretty well the first time you play it.
Yeah, I think deck building is one of the first big hurdles when you're learning to play Magic. You learn to play, usually play with precons or decks other people have made. Eventually, you want to kind of go out into the wider world, build your own decks. You see combination of cards, you're like, this would be cool. But it's a daunting task. There's a lot to it. So our sort of job here and our goal is to demystify it a little bit, make it easier for you to have some sort of starting point for when you're building your decks. I think even if you're an intermediate deck builder, we maybe hopefully have some little tips hidden in throughout this episode that will maybe even give you some level up moments, even if you've built a bunch of decks. But definitely if you are kind of new to deck building, our goal is to lay it out in such a way that like you can get something done and it'll play and it'll work. And of course, it always depends, but I think we've found these episodes to be helpful in the past, but the format changes. So because of updates to the way new cards have come out and changed the format in certain ways, it's nice to do these every couple of years to kind of give you the sort of newest, latest, and greatest info.
And if this episode inspires you to get building, build a new deck, go to cardkingdom.com/command to pick up some Magic cards. They've got a huge selection of singles and sealed product. If you're still in the pre-con stage, don't worry, they've got pre-cons for you. They also have a ton of cards. So if you're like, you know what, I'm confident now that I can put my first deck together, you can put a list together, you can paste it all into Card Kingdom, and then you can pick what version, what condition, what printing you want of each of the cards in your deck and get them all shipped in one safe package. I like shopping from somebody who has a ton of cards, so I'm not chasing dozens of envelopes through the mail. I always know that the cards I ordered are the ones that are going to show up on my doorstep all at the same time, so I can get sleeving and get playing. Plus, we know that they have the professional team to take care of anything and take care of you if anything should happen to your order. So go to cardkingdom.com/command and you're supporting the show and picking up some sweet product.
And once you get those cards, you want to keep them protected. Our cards have value. We don't want that value to be diminished. Ultra Pro is the game accessories brand that we trust our own collections to here at the Command Zone. If you go to ultrapro.com/command, you can find all kinds of cool products like their awesome Apex sleeves, which have the best shuffle feel of any printed sleeves on the market. You can theme all the stuff to your deck too, so especially if you're building off of a commander from a commander deck or something, they almost always have that commander printed on sleeves, playmats, deck boxes. You can make your battlefield look awesome while simultaneously protecting all of your game pieces. It's the best of all worlds. ultrapro.com/command. They are the game accessories brand that we trust. And also one good thing about their website is they always have discounts. They're always constantly sort of trying to move, product from the past out to make room for new stuff. And you often can find great deals on like binders and things like that. So definitely ultrapro.com/command. Go check it out.
Yeah. Plus, they've got the cool bright white mana 8 line that you can take to game nights live and MagicCon in Chicago. We always recommend that product for MagicCons because they're great to get signatures and get doodled on, but we're going to be there. So if you want to come with a cool playmat to get us to sign it, come to MagicCon and come to Game Nights Live more specifically on Friday. We're going to be putting on a huge show in a theater. We're not on the main stage anymore. They're putting us on a bigger side stage so we have room for more people to sit comfortably and watch the show. And that means, of course, that our show is going to be bigger and better than ever.
Yeah, we got a lot of cool stuff planned for this one because of the new venue. And just, we like to up our game every time anyway.
February 21st is that show. All you need is a badge for Friday or a weekend badge. Anything that gets you into the convention on Friday will get you into our show. It has no extra price or any funny business.
And it's in the same building. It's a theater, but it's not like you have to go outside or take an Uber or anything like that. You literally just walk across the hall and it's going to be there. So there's going to be a lot of extra seating, but still get there early. It does fill up. I mean, we've had, more than 1,000 people at these things in the past. So see you there.
At 6.
At 6 p.m.
It's a little later than it
which
has
is great
been in the
because
past.
then you could draft and not miss your event. Yeah, we hear that from people a lot. Oh, I signed up for an event. I didn't know.
Every podcast episode, we shout out one lucky patron, and this episode is dedicated to Karina Poole. Karina, you rock.
You definitely rock.
It's a big one.
Yeah, this is a big one. We know it's going to get a lot of views because the past 2 templates have done really, really well. So it's nice to update it, give some of our sort of newest information, and also just be talking about newer cards when, so you don't watch a template from 5 years ago and we're still talking about, Consecrated Sphinx and stuff. So what is the template good for, Rachel? Like, what do we... Oh, and we should say, we will link the old template, and there's going to be a bunch of our previous episodes that will be good sort of expanding on certain points from this template. And we'll let you know about those episodes and link them in the show notes so that if you're like, oh, that is interesting, I'd like to dive deeper on that, we've probably done it in the past and we'll help you find those episodes.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's a template for? Like, what's it good for? Why do we need it?
So this is just a great starting point for unsure deck builders. Somebody who is looking at a blank slate and doesn't know what exactly needs to go in their deck. You're like, okay, I want to build a token deck, but how do I build a token deck that works?
Yeah.
Usually you start with a commander, but it needs a certain amount of ramp and it needs a certain amount of draw and a certain amount of lands. But what is that amount is such a big question when you're first starting, because it's a lot about how the deck plays, but you need to have a deck to play the deck. So the template will help you just get a list of 100 cards together so you can start playing.
Yeah, as you start, you often start with a commander or a deck idea, and you start just finding cards that like, that seems good, and that seems good, and that seems great, and you end up with like hundreds of cards. And then from there to get down to the 62, 63 that you're actually going to put in the deck, not counting lands, it can often be like, I'm not really sure how to even decide. Do I want this one or this one or this one? They all kind of do similar things. How do I know? How many of this effect do I want? So I think giving some guidance on how to sort of get that narrowed down to what your actual deck is really helpful for people. And I just think even when putting together the template, it helped me organize my thoughts into how deck building works. Just like, they often say you learn more through teaching, and it's like, this is definitely true.
Yeah, I also think that like when you get excited about a deck idea, you start putting in all of the cards that make it work, and this one and this one and this. And then you have this pile of cards that when you're playing it in the game, you're like, I don't have any card draw.
Yeah.
Or I don't have any ramp, and my deck isn't working how I thought it would. So it just helps you check the boxes and like make sure your deck is eating its vegetables so it's healthy when it's playing. Rather than like what feels good when you're deck building, which can be the most fun, this sort of checks yourself so you know that you're prepared when you're actually in the game and need the cards to do stuff.
Yeah. We talk about Magical Christmas Land, which is often in deck building, you have these like crazy ideas of what's going to happen, but then you play the game and those things are really hard to pull off, or you realize like, oh, what are the chances that I even draw those 3 cards together, and then get them into play, and they're all high mana costs, and it's like, it was a great idea in deck building, but there's just no practical way to actually pull that off, and so I should probably like rearrange my deck a little bit so there's more efficient in other ways to be able to actually do some things rather than try and do everything and actually end up doing nothing.
Yeah. I would also say the deck building template is just a starting point.
Yeah.
This is literally to get you to 100 cards to start playing. And then as you're playing, you're like, oh, I think I have like too many draw spells. That's never possible. Like maybe I have too much ramp because my curve is so low.
Yeah.
Or maybe I want more of this effect and not of this effect. And you learn that by playing and getting to know the deck list. So it's not a rule that you have to always have all of these, like exactly these numbers in every single deck you have to make your deck good. In fact, that's never going to be the case for most of your decks. It's an average. It's a place to get you started so you can start making educated decisions when you're playing or you're goldfishing your deck.
Yeah, 100%. This is a guideline. It's not rules. Almost no deck will actually fall exactly in line with all the numbers and stuff we're going to talk about. But like Rachel said, it's a really good starting place to know that, hey, my deck's going to function on a basic level, but I will want to fine tune from there to the specifics of what my deck is doing. Because there's no way to make one template episode that's going to work for token decks and control decks and aggro decks and aristocrats decks and tchotchke decks and you name it, you go down the line. They're all so many and they're so different that start here and tweak from there. But it's good to have a starting place, because if you're just starting from like that 400 card pile, it can be impossible to get to a point where like you're actually like really happy with your deck.
Right.
So we're just trying to get you to that next step, and then maybe you check out our goldfishing episode, which will probably be linked in the show notes to kind of for the next step after that. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about one of the biggest questions. And I still get tweeted this at me like quite often. I'd say like once a month somebody asks this question, which is like, how many lands do I put in my deck?
Yeah.
How many lands is the right amount to run? And the funny thing is, if you just sort of Google it and look around, it's really hard to find consensus
Nobody agrees on this. Like, Commander creators of all stripes have different numbers. You look at different deck lists, and they all have different numbers, ranging wildly from numbers like 30 all the way up to like 45. And you're like, that's a big difference.
Huge. That's 15%
that's
difference.
An enormous difference.
Some of them have like crazy equations, like you're supposed to like take how many of this and that in your curve, and then you times it by this, and then you get that amount.
Frank Karsten did an incredible article that is based on 60 card Magic, and it's how many lands you should put in a 60 card deck.
Yep.
And then he did a very complicated equation that we'll put on the screen. You can use it if you'd like, that basically tells you, like, based on how much ramp you have and how much cheap card draw you have, here's how many lands you should roughly be running, with like some napkin math to modify it for the extra draw that all Commander players get at the beginning and the free mulligan.
Yeah.
And he said, but roughly the answer is 43, which is very high.
Yeah.
That's a very high number for most Commander decks. Like, even my lands decks are like barely at that number.
45 as a lands deck generally. That, like, I'd love to hit that number, and often I cheat a little. I'm at 43.
I know. So, and he's saying 43 for the average one. So we're not quite that extreme with it, because we do have a free mulligan, and Commander is like pretty casual, and we recommend a lot of ramp and card draw to make sure you're getting your land drops. So the number that I settled on for this template is 38.
Yep. And that feels right to me. You're going to go through your methodology of how you settle out that number. But I've been running 37 to 38 as just like the default standard for many years. And I never feel like my decks don't run. Like, actually, if you've ever watched me play, like one of the things I prioritize the most when playing the game is hitting land drops. Like, I'll jump through all kinds of hoops to make sure I don't miss a land drop, because I believe that's one of the easiest ways to just get wins. And then one of the easiest ways to lose is just you have access to 10 mana on turn 7, and I got access to 6. Like, that's just one of the easiest ways to lose. You're just doing more than I am. Doesn't matter what you're doing. You can just do so much more.
Yeah. It's also one of the easiest ways to not have any fun in the game.
Yeah.
Like, is to just not hit your land drops and fall behind and not make choices and not participate.
This is kind of a key sort of, it's emblematic of deck building too, because what is fun in deck building is often not as fun in the game. Like, all these crazy magical Christmas land things that this card will be sweet and blah, blah, blah. And then you get into game and you're like, well, the way games play out, they're too fast, or these things get removed, and I never actually get to do the thing that I was hoping for. And putting lands in your deck when you're deck building is not the fun part. So everybody tends to be on the low side of wherever they are. Like, I say 38, 37. I'm way more often going to have 36 or 35 than I am going to have 39 or 40. Just because that's just natural human inclination of, like, the fun stuff that happens that you read about is on spells, not on lands for the most part.
Yeah, this is a really interesting phenomenon. And I start every deck list with 38.
Yeah.
Like, that's where I start, and then I adjust from there. My average, so to make this episode, I went through a lot of stats of my existing decks. So I have like 25 decks that I pulled stats from. And even my average is 37.
Yeah.
And I know it should be 38. But like, my average number is 37, and it's 35 lands with 2 MDFCs.
Yeah, the MDFCs really average. Help you, yeah.
So it's this very interesting thing where I'm like, it's sort of a do as I say, not as I do situation. I guess it's 37.58, so it does round up to 38.
I think it's just nice to have the voice in your head of, like, you should know that the natural inclination of almost everybody is to cut lands, and so when you are cutting down, you should have a voice in your head that says, I should try really hard not to cut lands, because that's going to be my natural inclination, and that's going to be incorrect.
At least not until you've played the deck a few times to understand, okay, my curve is low enough that I don't need 38 lands, or my curve is high enough that I need more lands. I'm constantly wishing I was going to draw a land.
Well, and we're going to talk about goldfishing a lot in this episode, but how often when you're goldfishing do you ever go, boy, I have too many lands, I'm hitting my land drops, I'm just glutted with lands all the time, I need to cut them. That almost never happens for me. In goldfishing, it's the opposite, where I'm like, yeah, I need to add lands. Yeah. I tried to get away with it because I tried to convince myself of X, Y, and Z, but like, I'm just missing my 4th land drop too often or whatever.
So I did some math to sell 38, because I know a lot of players are listening to this and being like, I run 35 on average.
Yeah.
And you're just running too few lands, because here's why. So I've used a hypergeometric calculator, not calendar, that tells you the likelihood of drawing a certain category of things by a certain time.
Yeah, it gives you probability.
Yeah. So for lands, I was like, okay, in the top 7 cards, how likely am I to have 3 lands in my hand? How likely am I to have 2? using this calculator,
Yeah.
you are only 54.8% likely to hit 3 or more lands in your opening hand.
Basically a 50-50 shot.
50-50 shot of having 3 lands in your opening hand, which is what we want.
You mean I don't want a 50-50 shot. I want 3 lands in my
I
hand.
want 3 lands in
But
my
I only
hand.
have, half the time that's not going to happen.
And that's
basically.
with 38 lands. And then you're 82.8% likely to have 2 or more in your opening hand. So you're like pretty reasonable to have 2 in your hand, but like...
But 2 land keeps are pretty risky.
They're not my favorite. I don't need to draw
third, and it also makes it a lot harder to hit your 4th, even if you hit your 3rd off the top. So you're just projecting that uncertainty forward a turn or 2 if you keep a 2-land hand. Like even 2 lands with ramp is pretty risky.
Yeah.
You lose,
And that ramp doesn't mean anything if you miss that 3rd land drop.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I mean, when you consider the free draw, so that we draw on every turn, whereas 1v1 only draws if they go second, then the numbers get a little bit better. So if you include 8 cards, the top 8 cards of your library, you're 65.8% likely to have 3 lands. But that means that you kept 2 and drew a 3rd or had 3 in your opening hand.
Yeah, but when it's the 8th card, you have to keep that blind and get lucky to pull it. So you don't even know. I mean, you really want to see the 3 in your opening hand.
Yeah,
I didn't realize it was that much of a long shot, even with 38.
Isn't that crazy? And I mean, we do have a free mulligan in Commander. So like you have 2 chances at this 55% chance before you're punished.
Right, which gets you closer to, say, 75% chance to see it 3 lands in opening hand with the mulligan. Yeah.
With the mulligan. Yeah. But if you're the kind of player that you're like, why am I always mulliganing 3-4 times? And like, it's fine, my playgroup doesn't really, like, they'll let me keep 7 every time, but I'm always the last one shuffling. It's because you don't have enough lands in your opening hand.
Yeah. And this isn't even to talk about how that kind of dominoes into subsequent turns and, makes it even harder for you to hit like your 5th land. Like when you keep a 2-lander, what's the chances you're going to hit your 5th land drop in time, right? Because you would have had to draw 3 lands out of your first, 4 cards to do that. And maybe you got some card drawing stuff added in there, but still that's not very likely that you're going to just go 3 out of 4 cards as a land to hit your 5th land drop. So keeping 2 landers kind of compounds on you in a weird way, even if you have ramp in your hand. So you really want to see the 3rd one. It gives you a much higher chance of hitting the 4th, 5th, and 6th land drop. Yeah.
The interesting thing about that is if you are always mulliganing to get the right amount of lands, like if you run 38 lands and you're like, I'm mulliganing 3 times to get 3 lands in my opening hand.
Yeah.
Now you are less likely to be able to mulligan for specific pieces in your hand.
Right.
So you're like, okay, my deck always wants like a damage enabler on 2. Now you're mulliganing for 2 things, and your hand is even more difficult to find. Where you're like, okay, now I have a damage enabler, but I don't have the right amount of lands. Or now I have turn 2 ramp, but I don't have the right number of lands, or vice versa.
Yeah,
so
that's really interesting.
The more specific you want to be about the things that you have in your opening hand, the more lands you should be running, because it increases your likelihood that you can mulligan for a specific strategy piece rather than just having a functional hand.
Yeah, right. Like I need something with an attack trigger because that's my whole deck. But I finally found that, and it's a 1-land hand or it's a 2-land hand.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really interesting.
So that's my pitch for 38. And honestly, it's probably higher than that. So I just wanted to show you the math because 38's greedy.
38 is probably too low. Is the point. Yeah, it probably is true. Like, well, if Frank Karsten says 43, then it's 43 because that man knows his math. But
right.
Yeah, I've thought for years, like I probably should be running 40.
Right.
And it's just a good clean number, and and you always start. I always like put 40 lands in, and then just like any human being, I just chip away. Yeah, and then I go 38. I've been running 30 for years. It's fine. And then by the time I actually lock the deck, it's 36. And I'm like, what did I do? Yeah.
So here's the thing. You can fudge it a little bit because these days we have MDFCs, we've got channel lands, we've got ways to have lands that do stuff.
Right.
So it should be really easy to hit 38 lands.
Yeah.
Especially with the new MDFCs from MH3 that come in untapped if you need them to come in untapped. So I think if you're struggling to hit this number, 38, 39, just to feel good and confident that you're going to hit your lands, take a look at what lands you're running, making sure you have the MDFCs. You could play the 1-mana land cyclers from Lord of the Rings. I count those as lands because they're essentially tapped lands, right? You pay 1 mana to go get a land, and assuming that land comes in untapped, you play that land untapped. So you can fudge it. if you're inclined to do so. But that does mean you have no excuse. You should be running 38 lands.
The MDFCs I do count as lands. I don't count cyclers necessarily. I think that people also just sort of play MDFCs incorrectly. Like, you should look at them as lands first and spells second, and you shouldn't hesitate, even if it's Ball Gate Recovery or something, which I know is a great card to cast.
Play it.
If you have, 2 lands or 3 lands in your opening hand, just play it as your turn 1 play when you have no 1-drop, because then the fact that it comes in tapped doesn't hurt you in any way, and just like bite the bullet. It's a land. Your most important number 1 thing should be hitting your land drop every turn. Yeah, but people often, they hold it, they want to use it as a spell, they're hoping to draw another land, they don't, now they have to put it into play tapped late, and it sort of screws them up later. Just play those things as lands, and think of them like, this is here to be a land. It is only supposed to be a spell when I have too many lands in my hand.
Missing land drops ain't good. It should feel bad. All right.
We have an old episode where we kind of dive deep on lands. It's called The Ultimate Guide to Lands. It is episode number 455, so that'll be in the show notes.
Yeah, that'll give you a better idea for like how to craft a strong mana base and like what kind of lands that you're looking for. We can't spend a ton of time on that because it's a whole episode's worth.
Right. Okay, let's move to the next section, which is
your favorite.
Card Advantage, my favorite section. And this is the section that I, myself, and many people use as an excuse to cut lands. I'm drawing a lot of cards. I don't need as many lands in my deck, right?
I'll find them.
Yeah.
As long as they're cheap.
Yeah.
So just to define Card Advantage, these are cards that start as 1 card and give you access to more than 1 card. So this is any like 1 single card that will net to you more cards. If you have something like a Ponder that says literally draw a card on it, well, you spent a card to do it to get that card back. So that isn't card advantage, that's card selection.
Yeah. You basically said, I'm still going to have the same amount of cards at the end of this. I'm just going to get to choose which card a little bit better that I want.
Right.
Yeah. I want to say card advantage can get used in different contexts. So in the context of like limited and other things, they talk about card advantage as far as spending 1 card to get 2 cards worth of value, like a ravenous chupacabra comes in, it destroys an opponent's creature, and I have a 2/2 left over. So I have my 2/2. That's 1 card for me. My opponent lost a card, so I spent 1 card and kind of got 2 cards of value. That's sometimes referred to as card advantage. For our purposes here, though, we are talking specifically about cards that give you access to more cards that you can play. Less about what that takes away from your opponent and counting that part of the value equation.
Yeah, I just wanted to change the name here because we typically called it draw. And I think it gets confusing with players where they look at a card like Faithless Looting and it says draw 2 on it.
Right.
But what it actually says is draw 2, discard 2, and you've spent a card. So you're actually down cards.
Yeah, Faithless Looting is actually card disadvantage as far as like, you end up with less cards than you should.
You have better cards, and there's cards in your graveyard.
And you have a flashback card, which you can kind of use again to kind of even that out, but still. I think also like Impulse Draw, which is anytime you exile the top card of your library and you can play it until end of turn or until the end of your next turn or until whatever the requirement is. That we've traditionally put under the card draw category, and it would come under this card advantage category because those are sort of virtually in your hand for a limited amount of time. But I would count cards that say, exile every turn, exile a card off the top of your library. You can play it until end of turn. Well, that's giving you access to an extra card every turn. So that's very similar to draw and would go in this category.
And under some circumstances, self-mill can be considered card advantage. Like if you were playing Carador or something that lets you play creatures out of your graveyard or Muldrotha, you can consider self-mill card advantage because it gives you access to more cards that you will have access to. Self-mill doesn't count as card advantage in every deck because not every deck can play cards out of their graveyard reliably. But those kind of decks that are using their graveyard as a second hand can also consider those under the card advantage category.
Yeah, I would be a little bit hesitant or careful with that use of it as like card draw. When we're going to talk about numbers, like you should have this much card advantage in your deck. And the thing to think about with like the Carador example is if I count all of my self-mill as a card drop or card advantage piece, it cannot help me hit a land drop.
Right.
And so you have to be careful. I might count every piece of self-mill. And this is where I like to say it's more art than science, right? Because there's no way that I know of to use the hypergeometric calculator to come up with these numbers for you.
Right.
But like, I might just say, I'm going to count my self-mill cards as like 2/3 of a card advantage spell. So I'm not going to count them as a full, they're not the same as a Phyrexian Arena, which is just going to give me a card every turn. But they're a piece of a card advantage thing. So I will say, I've got 5 or 6 of these, and then I've got 10 pieces of other card draw, and that together I'm going to count as 12 or whatever, not 15 because some of it's self-mill. But it does give me card advantage, so I'm going to count it as some amount of that. Yeah. That's, I know for people out there who are new to deck building, like, well, geez, how do I figure that out? And I would say just err on the side of like not counting the self-mill in that way until you become more familiar, and just count the Night's Whispers and the Phyrexian Arenas and the Guardian projects as like that. Very clearly, those do draw me cards. Yeah. And so I will just count those. And this other stuff that I suspect is card advantage, but I'm not 100% sure, just don't count them for now. Yeah. And then as you play more, you'll be like, oh, I can count that. Yeah. And I can count it as this amount of one.
I will say, the number that I'm recommending is you should hit this number, and it's 12. You should have 12 cards in your deck that give you access to more cards. Yeah. Because this number bandages up all the other things that you're skimping on. And I know you don't want to play as many removal as we're going to tell you, and I know you don't want to play as many lands as we're going to tell you. Yeah. But do not skimp on the one thing that solves the skimping problem.
Yeah. Because think about it. If you have less removal in your deck, if you draw more cards, you will see the removal more often, just because by virtue of the fact that you're just seeing more of your deck every game. And it solves board wipes in that way, and it solves like key pieces in that way, and it can even solve like, I don't have enough synergy pieces a little bit. When I say solve it, it makes it better. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I will often be in the 20 plus range in this. And we tell people when they come on game nights, when they are mulliganing their opening hand for deciding like, hey, we're going to play one game here. It's going to be on camera and 1 million people are going to see it, and you got one shot. And what we tell them is like, don't look for like that hand that's like got access to 6 mana on turn 2 so you can do something really crazy early, because that happens all the time. The thing gets removed and you don't do anything else for the rest of the game. Right. What you really only care about, do you have enough lands and do you have card draw? If you do have that, then, hey, listen, maybe you win or you don't win, but you will do stuff the entire game. And that's really what we want to see on game nights. We don't want a guest to come in, they cast 4 spells and that's their entire game. We want you to come in and you're in the mix, you're doing stuff, you're making moves. Whether you win or not, you just have things to do. And that's what card draw does. Yeah.
So 12 pieces of card draw. And we're talking like Blue Sun Zenith, the big X spell that draws you a ton of cards. Or maybe it's Lelia the Blade Reforged. When she attacks, you get an extra card off of her.
Yeah, you impulse draw.
Like a Phyrexian Arena will give you an extra card every turn. Or maybe you're in green and you're playing big green things. You're playing Garruk's Uprising. That gives you trample and cards. Incredible. Even something like land tax that just gives you 3 basic lands when you're behind on lands, that counts as draw, because now you're definitely hitting your land drops. I have access to more cards, and I spent 1 card to get it.
Yep. Underrated card, land tax.
I agree. I did want to mention Sylvan Library. Yep. Definitely card draw. Yep. Only card selection unless you're paying life.
Yep. If you're not going to pay the life, though, don't put it in your deck.
Don't put it in your deck.
It's not good.
Because it's 2 mana scry 3 every turn. Yeah, which is fine. That's like fine.
It's not, though, because you can't.
Yeah, you can't put them on the bottom. You're right. You get stuck. Yeah, that's the kind of card that is like, if you're not going to pay life with it and you know what kind of player you are, it's not card draw.
Yeah. You should be paying the life every time, at least for 1 card, but probably for both, at least the first couple of times.
Yeah, you got to use it or lose it.
But that's strategy. We're not going to get into that as much. Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure that we're not mentioning things like Mind Stone. Mind Stone doesn't count as draw. It's ramp, but it draws you 1 card to replace the 1 card you have on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's a cantrip.
Yeah. Even Sensei's Divining Top, which will draw you a lot of cards, only replaces itself. Yeah. It never gives you like an additional card.
Yeah, I wouldn't count either one as card draw. In most decks, and we'll talk about intricacies in a second.
One more thing I wanted to mention is something like a Teferi's Ageless Insight that says, if you would draw a card except the first card you draw in each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. Doesn't draw you cards.
Right. Yeah. And this is another one where I think similar to the self-mill and Carador, you could call it card draw in certain decks, but you shouldn't just default put this in decks and think it's card draw.
Because it doesn't.
Yeah.
It says when you have card draw, you have a lot of card draw. Yeah. I see this kind of like enhancer type of card in decks a lot, where it's like, I don't know if you're drawing enough cards to actually play that. I think you'd be better served playing a divination that's 3 mana draw 2 cards than playing a 4 mana enchantment that when you draw a card draw spell, it's going to be really good. Okay, so that is the card draw section.
Run at least 12.
Just run 12.
Run 15 if you can.
If your deck doesn't work, run more. Like
I was just goldfishing my deck for game nights, which we are going to shoot soon. So I was building my deck and goldfishing it. And even like I'm the card draw guy, and even me, I was like, I just don't have enough velocity through my deck. I'm not moving through it. I'm not drawing enough cards. I'm finding myself with 2 or 3 too often, like just down to 2 or 3 cards in my hand. And, you know, I was like, just had to eat my vegetables, as you say, which is even me. I like card draw.
Yeah.
And be like, I have to find 2 or 3 more cards and just replace cards in here with, I just have to. And as soon as I did it, I found a card and then 2 cards that were very similar to it. And I slotted those in place of a couple other things. And it felt bad because I had to take my synergy down to a notch. But then actually my synergy went up because I drew more of the synergistic cards in the right order. I always hit my land drops. I could play everything. And my deck just hums so much better with those 3 cards. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something I've posted a long time ago that I really like is the worse your plan is, you're like my deck is play all the ponies, all the cards with like pictures of horses on them.
Yeah.
The more card draw you need.
Yeah, for
the
sure.
The lower your card quality is, the more card advantage you actually need in your deck. Because at this point, you need a quantity, right? If your quality is low, you need quantity. If your quality is high, maybe you need less quantity because your cards do more for you. But until you're there, card draw.
Well, also the thing about crazy plans is they're often pretty specific about like, I need one of this and one of this and one of this. And I don't do anything unless I have those 3 things going on. And it's hard to find 3 different things. And the easiest way to find it is look at more.
Is find them.
Yeah. So card draw just kind of like helps you solve that part of the equation. Where it's like, oh, my deck's pretty good if I go pony, that does this, pony that does that, pony that does this. But that's like hard to do if I just draw 1 card per turn because I just don't find the right ponies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I also, it's really hard to find card advantage cards with a picture of a horse on it. I speak from experience. All right. There's a lot more cards that go into your deck, and we're going to break down some of those after a few words from our sponsors.
Hi there, I'm Redshift. There's nothing more important than love. And I love going fast! That's why nothing gets my heart racing like my RAYCON wireless earbuds! I don't have time to take an hour-long pit stop for dead batteries when I'm zipping through my favorite podcast at triple speed! But with RAYCON's quick charge function, 10 minutes gets me an hour and a half of juice! That's the kind of fast I'm looking for! Plus, their latest model is better than ever! They got 32 hours of battery life, multi-point connectivity, and all sorts of sweet activated abilities! Heck, these earbuds even come with active noise cancellation, which is great when you've got to block out engine noise! Vroom, vroom! And just like me, RAYCONs are efficiently costed, starting at just half the price of other premium brands. With a price like that, I knew I had to snap up a pair quick, especially since they came in my favorite color, yellow! What, you thought I was gonna say red? Joke's on you, I'm a complex person!
Go to buyraycon.com/command to get up to 20% off site-wide. That's right, you'll get up to 20% off everything on Raycon's website, including 20% off all headphones too, when you go to buyraycon.com/command. Again, that's buyraycon.com/command. Sorry I'm late. I had to re-sleeve. Oh, your decks are looking cool.
Oh yeah, I've been loving this new Mana 8 line from Ultra Pro. These Apex sleeves are literally the best shuffle feel I've ever had. And it keeps my cards safe while repping my favorite color, red.
I'll do you one better. I'm showing my devotion to my favorite color, white, with the Alcove Edge deck box.
Ooh.
It's got the symbol on the front and also a cool stylized interior pattern.
Nice. But I think I got you both beat. I've got the Apex sleeves, the Alcove deck box, the padded binder, and this sleek stitch playmat, all in my favorite color.
Josh, that's green.
You play blue?
But with this setup, they won't know that ahead of time. They'll see this big, bold tree, and they'll think Josh has turned over a new leaf.
Yeah, you're not fooling anyone.
People will know. Everybody knows you play blue.
No, they don't.
Hey Murph! Yeah? What color is Josh playing?
Blue.
See?
Yeah, but he didn't even see all my stuff.
Keep your cards safe and stylish with the Mana 8 accessory line from Ultra Pro.
Choose from 6 stunning designs that let you show off or disguise your favorite colors in Magic, all while keeping your collection secure and protected. Go to ultrapro.com/command to get your hands on their premium Apex sleeves, along with deck boxes, playmats, binders, and more.
Support the show and rep your colors with Mana 8 at ultrapro.com/command.
Fee, fi, fo, fum. It's your favorite giant, 100-handed one. 100 hands means 100 arms means 100 underarms, more or less. And while I can block 100 creatures no problem, I can't block 100 armpits worth of BO. That's why I use MANDO, the whole body deodorant that blocks odor all day. MANDO makes me smell great. Plus, it's safe to use anywhere on my body. And I'm a giant. I've got a lot of body. So with MANDO, I can tackle my New Year's resolutions without smelling monstrous. I'll read 100 books, do 100 push-ups a day, and make 100 new friends.
Mando's starter pack is perfect for new customers. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice like mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. And as a special offer for our listeners, new customers get $5 off a starter pack with our exclusive code. That equates to over 40% off your starter pack. Use code COMMAND at shopmando.com. That's SHOPMANDO.com. Support our show and tell them we sent you. Again, that's code COMMAND at shopmando.com. Smell fresher, stay drier, and boost your confidence from head to toe with Mando. You browsing for some new tech?
Yeah, I'm building Tiamat and ARCHIDEKT. Ooh, how about Zergo and Ojutai?
Did you just drag and drop that card image directly into your deck?
Yep, with ARCHIDEKT, you can drag and drop card images from EDH, Rec, or Scryfall directly into the deck list. No typing required.
That is so cool.
Ooh, okay, check this out. I'm gonna drag and drop Dragon Storm into the deck, and then boom, I'm gonna drop a bunch of dragons on the battlefield.
A 9-drop, huh? Seems ambitious.
It was just for the pun. ARCHIDEKT is the best place to browse, brew, and playtest commander decks. Just go to archidekt.com/command-zone to get started.
That's ARCHIDEKT.com/command-zone.
We're moving on to the next category, which in my mind is less important
And more overrated.
and more overrated.
Still
than
powerful.
Card
We're not saying
Advantage.
don't put any in, but I believe that most people play too much of this and not enough of the card draw advantage stuff.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about ramp. Ramp are cards that give you more mana than you would have if you were simply hitting your land drops. So on turn 1, you have 1 mana. On turn 2, you have 2 mana. On turn 3, you have 3 mana. That's your regular mana progression. Ramp gives you 4 mana on turn 3 and 5 mana on turn 4.
Yeah, so
Now you've ramped.
Yeah, that's sort of the biggest example, classic example is like a mana dork like Landwar Elves or Birds of Paradise. They are ramp creatures because you play them, hopefully turn 1, but it could be later. And then on turn 2, you play your land. You've got your Birds of Paradise that you could tap for mana and your original land. So you have 3 mana that you could use on turn 2. You have ramped.
Yeah. Rampant growth is very common in this format as well. 2 mana sorceries that go find a land, put them on the battlefield.
Maybe where the name ramp comes from. We don't know for sure.
I think that's where it comes from.
There's a lot
no way that's not where it's come from.
But it's definitely later in the like Birds of Paradise and Landwar Elves existed for a long time before rampant growth.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's so many. I wasn't part of this conversations of when people define the thing. So, but I heard different stories from like old time players about why it's called ramp, but whatever.
Arcane Signet is also rampant growth for everybody.
I have a request for Sam at Ristic Studies. Will you make a video about why we call it ramp? Will you get to the bottom of this, Sam?
Can you do some research? You're the only one who can.
Yeah, exactly.
He knows all the people.
Yeah. Well, he's the only one that could do it in such a way that everyone would agree that like,
Yeah,
oh, well,
you're
Sam did it and figured it
So
out
we've
and
decided,
it is this.
yeah. Arcane Signet, Knight of the White Orchid, gives you more access to mana. I wanted to mention Dark Ritual, Jessica's Will are ritual effects. They give you temporary mana
Yeah.
and are difficult to categorize. I wouldn't call them ramp because they don't give you sort of incremental more value is what we expect in Commander. But in certain decks, this is the kind of mana that you want. You want bursts of mana for one big turn.
Well, just because we don't put it in this category doesn't mean it's not good or powerful,
Yeah,
right? Like
exactly.
we said, cantrips don't count as card draw. But
Right.
that
They're
doesn't
still
mean we don't
good.
think cantrips are good.
Right.
There are decks built around cantrips. Cantrips are awesome. One of my favorite cards is Gitaxian Probe.
Right.
But it's not card draw or
Right.
card advantage. Just in the same way that I think Dark Ritual and Jessica's Will are really good cards, very powerful. Mana Geyser, I play that all the time.
Yeah.
But I don't count them in the ramp category because, like you said, it's not repeatable. So
Right.
it's probably more of a synergy piece or something like that. Or, like Mana Geyser, Jessica's Will, Dark Ritual can kind of go in any decks of those colors. Maybe you can count them as like part of a ramp thing, but I would count them probably more as like enablers, ways that help my strategy move along a little bit quicker.
Sure. The point of ramp is to let you do more things with your turn.
Yeah.
And it usually means we're getting to a double spell or we're trying to cast a bigger spell. And your ritual effect will help you do that one time, but now you're behind the next turn because you're both down a card and you spent a card to have a temporary burst, while all of your opponents spent a card to have a more permanent burst of mana. So you can consider those as not ramp until you know your deck a little bit better. I haven't said the number that we recommend for ramp, which is a big one. I'm recommending 10 pieces of ramp for the average deck. And 10's pretty low, actually. I used a different calculator for this one. It's one of the many calculators on Salubrious Snail's website. If you only run 10 pieces of ramp, you are 54% to have 1 in your opening hand. So you're like a little likely to have it. When you combine that with only 38 lands, now you have to mulligan a little bit more to get there. But 54% to have 1 in your opening hand, and 63% to have 1 by turn 2. That's with the draw, and then you draw on your second turn as well. So that's like pretty good.
Close to 2/3, yeah.
If you want to reliably have 2 mana ramp on turn 2, like if you have a 4 mana commander, and you're like, I always want my 4 mana commander on turn 3, you would have to go as high as like 14 or 15 2 mana ramp spells to reliably be able to have it, and with 38 lands. Or you play more lands and 10 pieces of 2 mana ramp, and then you can mulligan for the 2 mana ramp rather than having your lands. Mm-hmm. So, but I would say like 10 for the average amount of the average deck and for the average desire to ramp. That means that like if you have 1 on turn 2, that's great, but more likely you'll draw it at some point and kind of fit it into your curve and incidentally ramp, and that is often fine. But I did want to say, like, I think the reason that I'm a little lower on ramp these days is because if you play your land and just hit your land drop, that is going to put you ahead or at least on par with most of the people at the table. Because if you're not hitting every single land drop, then your ramp and growth isn't ramp anymore.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's just, it kind of was a land.
It was a land that cost you 2 mana.
Yeah.
Lands are broken.
Yeah.
Lands are free. If your ramp and growth was a land, would it be better most of the time? Yes. So I think having fewer two mana pieces of ramp and just more lands is going to more consistently give you the game that you want, rather than like loading up on 2 mana ramp and cutting back on lands.
Yeah. I think people are really enamored with because an easy way to see that you have an advantage is you are just doing something bigger before other people can. So ramp tends to sort of obviously look really good because those turns where you're like, on turn 4, I cast an Ugin. Yeah. And it's like that's like obviously very powerful, where it doesn't feel as good if like on turn 4 I drew 6 cards, or that'd be a lot,
that'd be sick.
But I set up an engine that was going to draw me 2 cards every turn on turn 4.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I think a lot of people wouldn't see that as more powerful than the Ugin, but it is. Mm-hmm. It's just going to win you more games than the Ugin will. But it feels cooler to be like, boom, huge thing. Right. And everybody else is still in the Stone Ages, and it's like, rah. Mm-hmm. So I can understand why ramp kind of gets quote unquote overrated, I think, a little bit. I'm closer to 12, I'd say, in my decks. That's where I want to be. I don't quite go as high as 14 to sort of make it more guaranteed that you get one. But yeah, I think in that range, I think a lot of people are up closer to 15, 18. And I think we haven't said this yet, but EDH decks have like totally different metrics because they're playing games that are going to end by turn 5. And so if the game's going to end by turn 5, hitting your 5th land drop is not as important, right? Because the game might just be over, so you're prioritizing other things. But for casual games are going to go to turn 9, 10 maybe. And so the advantage of this kind of stuff kind of has much longer to play out because you get those additional 3 or 4 turns. And if you have a Birds of Paradise and a Signet and they didn't, that's like 10 extra mana you had over the course of that game or more. So it kind of matters more. Right.
It's I think especially when you're thinking about like 2 mana ramp as ramp, like when you're playing CEDH, you're playing 0 mana ramp and 1 mana ramp and all of these like these rituals. But if you're just playing 2 mana, like to get 1 more mana on your next turn, it's not it, and you have 1 less mana this turn. They're not really running that many signets and stuff in those at higher power levels.
Yeah, it's a lot of 0 and 1 mana stuff.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about if you do want to go up to 12, because I do think 12 is like a reasonable bump in terms of how likely you are to have a rock by turn 2. It's 70.4% to have 1 2-mana rock by turn 2 if you're running 12. So if it's like, if you want to be more consistently always having that signet or the rampant growth or something on turn 2, you can go up to 12. I tend to run fewer because my commanders tend to be cheaper these days. Like I've got 2 mana commanders, 3 mana commanders that the 2 mana ramp just doesn't help for. But when my ramp swings higher, it's when I usually have 4 mana commanders. When I want to play a rampant growth on turn 2 and my 4 mana commander on turn 3.
Yeah, and like we said, I think the template is always just a starting place, and there are reasons why you would or wouldn't. Like you said, I think you probably want a little more 2 mana ramp when your commander's 4 mana value. when it costs 4, because it helps you get your commander out a turn early and presumably your plan online early. And if you have a 2-drop commander, you probably want less 2-mana ramp, because you know what you're doing on turn 2 most of the time, which is playing your commander. And you'll know that through goldfishing, where you have that awkward thing where you're like, oh, I got 2-mana ramp pieces, but I want to get my commander online because that's my whole plan. And you start like thinking like, oh, yeah, I just don't want as many rocks. Yeah. Or I can go to 3-mana rocks that are a little bit better for other reasons because that's my spot to play them. Or I want to push down towards more 1-mana dorks because
I have a 3-mana commander.
Yeah, exactly. So
we just talk a lot more about the kind of ramp that you want and you should look for in episode 303. That's a complete guide to mana ramp. Gives you an idea for like to more critically think about what kinds of ramp you're putting in your deck. At this point in the commander meta, we're recommending 10 pieces of ramp in every single deck, up to 12 if you want to more reliably have it on turn 2. All right. The next category I want to talk about is I've changed the terminology a little bit from what we have typically used, but I don't think it's that different. I'm calling it targeted disruption.
Right. And we used to call this removal.
Right. So
or maybe interaction at certain points.
Yeah.
We haven't always been consistent about what we call it.
That's why I was like, you know what? We're calling it this. So targeted disruption is when you spend 1 card to disrupt one of your opponent's cards. So I spend a Swords to Plowshares to kill that one creature.
Right.
And for this, there's a lot of different ways that you can think about targeted disruption. It's a little more vague than removal. It, of course, could be a Swords to Plowshares or a Naturalize or an Unsummon that like bounces a creature or a permanent. But it could also be counterspells that counter a spell on the stack, or like a Wasteland or a Ghost Quarter that you spend a land to deal with their land. I think thinking about it more generally as like, okay, the way that I'm disrupting them isn't specifically removing their thing. It's just messing with their plans somehow. Even something like a March of Swirling Mists that like phases out a creature, I would consider disruption. Whether it's targeted disruption or mass disruption, which we'll talk about in a second, is sort of up to how you play it in your deck. But in this category, I'm talking about cards that you're spending 1 card to get 1 card. And for this category, I am recommending 12, which is a lot. And a lot of people are going to look at 12 and be like, I don't run even close to 12. I run 5.
Yeah, it's even maybe more than lands, it's the most skimped on area. And you know when you're playing with a lot of sort of newer players, when you're in a pod and it feels like nobody is touching anybody else's stuff.
Right.
It's just one of the clear marks of like a more experienced player that they are able to sort of reach out and mess with, stop things, kill things, remove things, bounce things, whatever, of other people's, disrupt other people's plans. And it's just the thing that you get burned by enough, you start being like, listen, because it's one of the things that's really hard in playtesting and goldfishing to count for. And it's the eat your vegetables thing again, where you're just like, I'm not going to allow myself to cut removal spells because I do know in the game those are good, but in deck building, they're not the fun part. Yeah.
And you can put them in flavorfully if you're building an elf deck. You can run like Reclamation Sage or that kind of thing. But making sure that you just have something that means you don't get run over by another deck is going to make, I think, gameplay more interesting because they don't resolve a permanent and you lose to it. It's going to make you more engaged with the other turns that you're playing against, and it's going to make you a better Magic player because you get to consider how this game plays out. You get to affect how this game plays out. And like I'm always having more fun when I know that like one thing isn't going to mess me up.
Yeah, and you think of it as one of the reasons that people like love Magic is the depth of strategy that's available. Well, if we all just solitaire our own thing, and then you solitaire your thing and you solitaire yours, and it's just like who did the most, and there's no ability or desire to like, insert myself in there and disrupt what they're doing. There's just not that much strategy, right? That is just solitaire. That's not that. There is some obviously, but like the fact that you have to account for what they might do and change your plays, and the fact that they're going to account for it so you can bluff things, like it starts to layer strategy in a really interesting way where like that's where you get into like, I did this because I know that they think that I think that they think that they're going to do that. And so That's where you really get into the mind games and the deep strategy. So I think, what you said is about it being more fun is absolutely true, and that's why. Because ultimately, you want to win games of Magic because you outplayed the opponents, not because they spent more money on their cards or they just happen to draw better. Those things will happen, but I think we'd all like it to be a game where, like, I was smarter, and that's why I won. Yeah, and this gives more ability for that to be the reason for the outcome.
Otherwise, you're just playing Candyland, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just feels like you're like, okay, who draws the right cards in the right order? And it worked out the best for it. Like, you can play Chutes and Ladders, but that doesn't have the same sort of interactive.
You're probably
thing
not
that
playing
Magic
Magic because you want it to be like Chutes and Ladders.
Right. Yeah. You're interested in the nuance and the choices. And I think having ways to disrupt your opponent's plan or to, protect your own plan, those are the interesting parts of the game. And I think like putting removal in your deck is a good way for the deck builder to take care of the deck player. Yeah. And I think that is what this template is sort of all about, is making sure that the crazy-brained 2 a.m. deck brewer is taking care of the person who's actually playing and trying to figure out how to use this deck. So the recommendation for targeted disruption is 12. That doesn't have to be 12 removal spells.
Yeah.
That could be ways to tap creatures. That could be ways to bounce creatures or phase them out or interact with lands, or like targeted graveyard exile, like Scavenging Ooze is absolutely targeted disruption for your opponent's plan.
Yep. It disrupts the graveyard decks.
It disrupts their plan. So you don't have to think about it as like, I run like 12 Swords to Plowshares. How boring. There's a lot of different ways and axes that different decks fight on, and you need to be able to consider them when you're thinking about the things that you need to disrupt.
And the reason you want 12 is because you want to have a high probability that you've got one when you need one.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people think in the wrong terms of like, well, this one can, get rid of 3 different kinds of permanent types, so it kind of counts as 3. And it's like, no. That's not the reason that you want the number. You want the number because when you need it, or you'll lose, or, get so far behind that you can't win.
Yeah.
And so you need to build your deck in such a way that you will get the removal spells and have them at the ready when you need them.
Right. We said if you put 12 cards in your deck, you're 70.4% to have one by turn 2. And I just like having one in my hand. Yeah. I don't spend one on turn 2 most of the time, but if I need to, I can. If somebody powers out their commander with a Dark Ritual, I want to be able to Swords to Plowshares that thing. So having one just keeps you safe. It doesn't mean that you're spending one. It just means you reliably are able to protect yourself.
When you make decisions knowing that you've got it and what you've got too, like, oh, that thing over there, I will have to deal with it. I know I have the way to deal with it, so I can make these other plays just knowing I've got that taken care of. But if you didn't have it taken care of, I would act totally differently and sequence my plays differently.
Right.
So just having the removal in hand, even if you're not going to use it right now, it adds to the strategy in that way. Yeah.
I did want to mention, because a couple of people asked about it, I'm not considering things like Heroic Intervention or Snakeskin Veil protection cards to like board protection in this category because they're protecting your game plan. They're not disrupting your opponent's. Your opponent's plan is not to remove your creatures most of the time, especially not in casual. Yeah. So it's like that isn't messing what they're doing. That's just protecting your own stuff.
Okay, well, if that was targeted disruption, then the next category is very aptly named mass disruption.
Mass disruption. So this is spending one card to disrupt many of your opponent's cards.
Yeah.
So more colloquially, we've referred to these as board wipes, but I wanted to
wraths,
I just wanted to kind of expand our definition of what it means to interact with a lot of cards, especially because Commander design has changed a lot since we made these numbers. So originally it was like 2 to 3 board wipes, but I'm recommending that we include 6 pieces of mass disruption. And that can include board wipes, so your Wrath of Gods and your Supreme Verdicts.
But it's probably not 6 of those.
But it's not 6. It also could include a Bane of Progress that destroys all artifacts and enchantments.
Yep.
That's mass disruption. You spend 1, you destroy a lot of things. Disrupt Decorum is goad all of your opponent's creatures.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's not a board wipe, but what it says is your plans for this turn don't affect me.
Right.
Which is mass disrupting, especially if you're
I'm not saying that one thing isn't going to touch me. I'm saying like all the stuff.
All this stuff, not my problem right now.
Yeah.
It might be my problem in a second, but not right now.
Yeah.
I would also include something like a propaganda to be mass disruption.
Interesting.
Because it says these creatures, less of my problem. Right. I'll still maybe need to interact with at some point, but right now, that's not an issue for me. like a decimate that blows up multiple targeted things. I would consider that mass disruption. And all of these you can see are like sort of dealing with different things, where it's like Wrath of God deals with creatures and Propaganda deals with creatures, but something like a Collector Oof or a Stony Silence is a mass disruption for artifacts and activated abilities. And it's also like the thing I learned most about changing this title from like Wipes or Wraths to Mass Disruption is which of my decks are highly interactive.
Like which have the most of this stuff?
Because suddenly you start looking at like, oh, this Thalia that has everything come in tapped, that's a mass disruption spell.
Yeah.
And this deck has 12 mass disruption spells. So you're like, I understand the strategy of this deck a lot better than I did, but when I was just saying board wipes.
Right. It's just, it can disrupt my opponents like a lot.
Like a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm only spending one card to do it. So I think sort of expanding your mind about how you use these things is interesting. Because like I would consider Fogs a mass disruption spell as well, where it's like you attacked me, that was your plan. Well, that's what I have to say about your turn.
Let me ask you two questions here, because like Grasp of Fate type stuff.
Yeah.
Where do you put those?
I would consider it mass disruption.
Sorry,
yeah.
Just so for the audience.
Yeah.
That's I play it and I pick off one thing from each opponent.
Right. This was a tricky one because originally I had targeted disruption as like 1 to 3 permanents.
Yeah.
But I think for the sake of clarity, I would call it a mass disruption spell because it deals with multiple things and you're starting to impact the board in a very heavy way. I like the idea of considering the mass disruption spells as like I'm getting their card advantage spells, like we were like in the more literal sense that we were talking about before, where I'm spending one card and I'm sort of like messing with multiple things, whereas targeted disruption is card disadvantage. You spend one card to deal with one card, but you're down cards against the other two. So I guess they're card parity because it's one you spend one to get rid of one
from
each.
everybody, yeah.
But I think just for clarity, I would consider
So once we're at parity,
disruption.
maybe that's mass disruption?
Yes,
I think
think
if it got rid of just two things?
I think, like, for me,
Ashes to Ashes or something like that. Yeah.
it starts being more targeted disruption. Yeah. So if it's you spend one card to deal with two cards and you're down against one of your opponents, then I would start considering it being more targeted.
It's an interesting way to look at it, which is like, am I down cards to the table or not? If I'm at parity or I'm advantaged, that's mass. And if I'm behind to even one player after making the play, then as far as like I got rid of two things, I used a card, so the fourth player is like sweet.
But it can also be like a tempo play. Like I consider a Fog a mass disruption spell. It deals with you're down a card, so it's not necessarily about the card disadvantage. You're down a card and they still have their things, but you dealt with a big play if you're spending a Fog to deal with it. In that way, I'm also considering Teferi's Protection a mass disruption spell.
Interesting.
Because it does so much to muck up a turn. It deals with the turn the reason you're casting it, so the big spell or the big attack that's happening, and then all of the things that could happen. So I think that the reason Teferi's Protection feels as powerful as it is, it's not because it's a board protection, it's because it is a mass disruption spell that messes with so many plans that it starts to fall into this category.
I think probably too, it's not super important if you have a couple of your interpretations of certain cards that fall on either side of the fence.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you say, well, for me, I count Fog as a targeted disruption. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Decimate or Grasp of Fate. It doesn't really matter that much, right? Okay, that's one of your 12, and then you need 6 of the mass disruptions. Or if you flop the one over because you could make the case that like it's mass and not targeted, fine. I think your deck will be fine as long as you're sort of like whatever your reasoning is for it, wherever exactly the line is. I do think that's interesting.
Yeah.
I agree with Teferi's Protection for sure.
I'm also considering Graveyard Hate as mass disruption. So something like a Bojuka Bog messes with a lot of setup that your opponent has been putting effort into. If it's used in a disruptive way, of course, I would consider it mass disruption. So the other thing that's really interesting is there are some spells that are both targeted disruption and mass disruption, depending on how they use it. Usually overload spells. So Vandal Blast can be targeted. It can also be mass.
Yeah.
Cyclonic Rift, or even like Galadriel's Dismissal, can be used to phase out one creature or protect one creature, or phase out an entire board or protect your entire board.
So let's say I had a Vandal Blast in my deck. Do I now need 11 other targeted disruption and only 5 other mass disruption, or should I place that firmly in one and not take one away from each category?
I would say you can pick how you tend to spend it the most. Like I would decide it's one of them. Like I would decide it's mass disruption for me. I usually spend Vandal Blast to blow up all the artifacts.
It's only like an emergency break the glass where you use it the other way. Same with Psych Rift too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But I could
But you should place it in one and not both, probably.
I think you could put it in both and be like, look, I got them, my base is covered. But I do think it's fudging the line a little bit. But then you could only have like, instead of having a total of 18 mass and targeted disruption total, you could get that number down to just 12. I know.
And say 6 of these if you wanted to cheat. We're going to talk about overlap later. And I
think this is fudging the line.
We have to be a little bit careful. Yeah.
Okay. So that is how I'm thinking about mass disruption. And I wanted to break this down a little bit because this number is 6, but you kind of want to vary the things that those deal with. So I would probably play like 2 to 3 creature board wipes and maybe one way to deal with all the artifacts and enchantments and maybe one piece of graveyard interaction. Or if you're like, you know what, my deck is really soft to artifacts and enchantments and really relies on creatures. So maybe I'm going to play 2 or 3 pieces that deal with all of the artifacts and enchantments and only 1 or 2 ways to deal with all of the creatures. Is how you can kind of think about this category, but know that you need cards that you spend 1 to just set all of you guys back.
There are a lot of games that's the only way you would ever have a chance to win. Mm-hmm. There's not really another, just the way, especially in casual where like we don't have combo and stuff like that. There's a lot of times where just like the way this game went, this person got to a fast start or whatever happened. My only conceivable, reasonable chance to sort of have a chance to win this game is if I can hit the reset button in some way, shape, or form. So you have to have reset buttons in your deck. Otherwise, well, you can't really cast those if they're not in your deck, I suppose. Yeah.
I think this is a very interesting category, and honestly, it has made me look at a lot of my decks very differently to think about, the ways that my deck is interacting with a lot of pieces all at once. And if you have a deck that you're like, why do people not like playing against this deck, or why does it feel bad to play this deck?
Probably has a lot of mass disruption.
It probably has a lot of mass disruption, and then you can be like, okay, now that I see this, which of these are like really necessary? Or maybe that's you just have a better understanding of how interactive and controlling your deck is. Like my Mangara deck has 10 pieces of targeted interaction and 14 pieces of mass interaction.
Yeah, so it's...
And you're like... So
it's
it
like
is,
screwing them up big time.
It messes with them.
Yeah.
And when you look at it as like just removal and board wipes, you're like, it's got like 10 pieces. That's nothing.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more than that. Okay, so... We've talked about a lot of different categories, and we're going to have all of that be on the board at one point in a second here. But I want to...
Those last 4 are the 4 that kind of every deck needs in some way, shape, or form, right? Or 5. Well, lands.
Lands, card advantage, ramp, mass, and targeted and disruption.
Yeah, so there's no deck you're going to build, for the most part. Maybe there's like a 1% of decks or something that are weird. But like that won't have at least some cards in all of those categories. Because they are just fundamental to the game. Yeah,
to how we play Magic for sure. And if you haven't thought about your decks this way, if you haven't like broken them into categories, I would suggest putting your decks online. We use ARCHIDEKT. ARCHIDEKT's awesome for this. And you can just tag your cards as the categories that we're talking about. ARCHIDEKT has an auto tagger. When you dump cards in, it will put them automatically into categories. I turn that off. I like to do it by hand because I get an idea for how my deck works as I'm sorting. And then you can sort of see the cards that work in multiple categories for your deck. But then you get to really look at your deck spelled out in terms of like, I only have 4 pieces of ramp, or I only have 4 pieces that actually are card advantage. And you can sort of see where these problems exist in your decks when you spell them out. You can even lay them out on the table. I just like them in digital because they can exist in multiple categories and you can express that nuance a little bit better than you can when you're just looking at cards on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the most important parts of the deck building process is just like checking these little categories. I'm constantly like, how much card do I have? How much ramp do I have? Mm-hmm. And then I am constantly like, how much removal do I have or how much interaction or disruption? Because that's the thing I know that in goldfishing is not going to, like, I'm not going to feel because I don't have an opponent when I'm goldfishing. And I just have to be like, trust the numbers, make sure that I've got enough because I know when I play, I want it. So it is just a thing you're just sort of constantly keeping tabs of as you move cards around. Maybe this one, maybe not that one. I want to lower my curve and I need more zombies, and then you look at it again, you're like, oh crap. Well, in doing that, I now only have, two mass disruptive pieces in the whole deck. Okay, well, I got to figure out how to get a couple back in there now.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, and we've just talked about the vegetables, right? We've talked about the stuff that people don't want to put in their deck, but we have decided that every deck needs 10 pieces of ramp, 12 pieces of card advantage, 12 pieces of targeted disruption, 6 mass disruption, 38 lands, and 30 plan cards.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they hear the template for the first time, are going to be thinking like, geez, most of my deck now is vegetables, as you like to call them. You know, the ramp, the card advantage, the disruption, that adds up to, what is that, 40 cards?
Yeah.
If you have 38 lands, I've only got, a little bit left to play with, and it makes it feel like, boy, I'm not going to have as much of the fun stuff, quote unquote, as I want to. But there are ways around that, and we're going to talk about overlap at a certain point, but cards play in more than one category. So a card might be a synergy piece and a ramp piece at the same time. So you actually have a lot more meat to play with than you think of. So bear with us here.
Yeah. Because I listed all like 10, 12, 12, 6, 38, 30. That adds up to 108. That is too many cards for a deck.
Yeah.
So you know that some of your cards are going to overlap.
They're going to play in 2 roles or maybe even 3 roles, right?
We've already referred to like modal double face cards. So lands, like Sink into Stupor is a great example. Yeah. It's both interactions, targeted disruption, and a land. And I would fully count it in both of those categories because in the early game, it's one thing. In the late game, it's another thing. And having, like, being able to raise both of those numbers makes your deck much stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. At some point in the deck building process, I always am like counting my removal, and I'm like, I need a couple more pieces. And I'm like, did I add those MDFCs yet? Nope. There's a couple of free ones. That's great. Done. It feels good. It's like finding money in your pocket.
Yeah. It's free, right? Yeah. I mean, even just throwing like a demolition field or a ghost quarter into your deck is a land.
Yep.
And it is a disruption piece because it can interact with your opponent's lands.
Yep.
So having, like, some of these are freer squares than they look like. I already mentioned running a Reclamation Sage in like an Elves or a Shaman deck will destroy an artifact or enchantment, and it adds your overall creature type. So overlap is a lot simpler than it looks, especially as cards get more and more modal in card design.
Yeah.
Like a great example of a card that is both interaction or targeted disruption and ramp is Insidious Fungus. This is like the new Caustic Caterpillar that came out in Duskmourn that you can either pay 2 and sacrifice to destroy an artifact or enchantment, or you can draw a card and put a land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. That fills 2 roles. In the early game, it's probably your ramp. In the late game, it's probably your targeted disruption.
Yep. If it goes in a deck that wants things in the graveyard or that wants, things to be sacrificed, it can fill a 3rd role indeed. And I think that's one of the things about overlap is that's where the real like art of deck building comes in is how many cards can fill multiple roles at an efficiency that is acceptable for, the speed at which whatever your commander games run at. And that is why you can, you're kind of like 108 total things is actually kind of, I would say, conservative. Like you can have a lot more than that. You can have 40 or 50 cards in your deck that are the fun meat part because this one, because every, almost all your card draw and another thing in your deck. And almost all of your ramp is ramp and it's removal and it's an elf. It's filling 2 roles. So yeah, this is where the fun part comes in and sort of the chemistry of it all works.
Yeah, I wanted to break down the plan section a little bit. So planning is just, what's the goal? What are you trying to accomplish with your deck? Like if you have an aristocrat deck, the plan is to make a ton of things to die and benefit in some way. So like the things that you need to do to get this done is all a part of the plan. And it also includes like things that benefit from the plan or things that turn the plan into an actual win in Commander. So this can include your win cons. This includes your enhancers, your enablers, your payoffs. All of that can live under this category. But
your commander can be the plan or can be a piece of the plan.
That's the interesting thing about this. So I want to break down what each of these terms sort of mean, and then we'll get into these numbers because they're a lot more flexible than the vegetables we're talking about in the first half.
Right.
So first I wanted to talk about enablers. These are just cards that make the plan work. If the plan is to make a ton of things and have them die, you need token makers. You need sacrifice outlets. These are just simply cards that you have to have in order for the plan to happen at all.
Right. Yeah. So if it's an aristocrats deck, the basic plan is you sacrifice your own creatures for benefit, right? So you got to have creatures to sacrifice and something to sacrifice them to. That is
Right.
for the plan to work. Those two things have to be happening, right?
If you're an enchantress deck, you need enchantments.
Yep.
It's a very low bar, but you can clear it. This will also include some of your protection spells. I would consider them in here. So like if you're worried about committing a bunch of things to the board and you're like part of the plan is having a ton of creatures, then I would consider a heroic intervention part of your
Enabling strategy. Sure.
Yeah. So your board protection, your recursion, all of those are sort of just like, this is what the plan is, and here's how we make it actually happen.
Mm-hmm.
The second category is payoffs, and these are cards that benefit from the plan happening.
Right.
So in an aristocrat strategy, it's the aristocrats. It's Blood Artist, it's Zulaport Cutthroat. It's cards that say when a thing dies, benefit.
Yeah, think about Blood Artist. It doesn't make creatures and it doesn't sacrifice creatures. All it says is like, yeah, when you do the plan, I will pay you off for that. I will reward you for executing plan. And so whatever the plan of your deck is, if this thing is a reward for doing the plan, then it is a payoff.
In an enchantress deck, it's the enchantresses.
Right.
When you cast an enchantment, draw a card. It's Sigil of the Empty Throne. When you cast an enchantment, you get an angel.
Yep.
So it's, all right, we see the plan. We like the plan.
Yeah, the plan is play a lot of enchantments. Great.
Great.
If you're doing that, I'll reward you for it.
You can have this.
Yeah, exactly.
This will also often include your win cons. So I would say like an overrun goes in here.
Yeah,
Craterhoof.
Craterhoof, absolutely, right? What does Craterhoof reward you for? Having a lot of creatures.
Right.
That's it. So if plan is make a lot of creatures, how do I pay off? Oh, Craterhoof.
I have a lot of creatures. Here we go.
Well, I will weaponize that for you even further.
Yeah. If the plan is like make a ton of mana, then your payoffs are often going to be X spells or something like that can win the game by
Could be
activated
even like
abilities
a Thrasios or something, right?
like that.
Some place to put the mana
Yeah.
could be a payoff. Yeah.
So those are your payoffs. Enhancers are the final category that goes under plan cards. These are multipliers. They say they make the plan better, but they don't actually contribute to the plan themselves.
Yeah.
So
Force multipliers. Doubling Season's like a classic one.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't do anything.
No.
But if you're making tokens, it will force multiply the amount of tokens you make.
Yeah.
So, but it doesn't make tokens. It doesn't sacrifice tokens. It doesn't pump tokens. It doesn't like. It doesn't do anything. Yeah. Taste of Karloff you have down for the aristocrats example.
Right. It says when things die, it triggers 2 times.
Yeah. It doesn't make things die. It doesn't make things to die. Yeah. It doesn't even do the thing that it doesn't Blood Artist, right? Like when stuff dies, it also doesn't do anything unless something else is saying
also
do
have
something. So it's like and that doesn't mean these cards are bad. But you do have to be careful about this category. It's easy to have way too much of this.
I agree. Enhancers are something that I am always a little bit wary of. So these are also like damage doublers or your token doublers, Anointed Procession and Mundrak, that kind of thing. And having too many of them just means that you don't have enough things to actually do.
The plan actually isn't getting enacted because a lot of your resources are taken up with too far down the road.
Right.
Like, yeah, you have so many things saying like, when the plan's going, we're going to be awesome. And but I put so much resources there that the plan never goes.
You're like, but is the plan going?
Oh, crap. I used to, I describe Vidalcanori and now High Fate Trickster as an enhancer.
I agree.
It's usually not the plan to cast things at flash speed. So all it does is make subsequent plays more powerful.
It improves the plan.
Yeah, exactly. It force multiplies everything else you do after it, but you have to be really careful about these types of effects because otherwise it's just a 4/2 flyer.
The other thing that you have to think about is when you're constructing the 99 of your deck is what role is your commander playing?
Yeah.
Usually your commander is part of the plan. And it's usually one of these three things, an enabler, a payoff, or an enhancer. So I wanted to talk about those.
Sometimes it's all three now.
Sometimes it's all 3 of those things.
And those are the powerful ones, yeah.
So like the first one I was going to talk about is like, okay, what if your commander is a payoff? Something like Yuriko that says whenever a ninja you control deals damage to a player, reveal the top card of your library and drain everybody.
So the plan would be
thing.
ninjas are dealing damage to players.
Ninjas hit.
Yeah.
And yes, Yuriko is a ninja, and yes, she contributes to the plan. So in a way, she is both an enabler and a payoff.
Yeah.
But largely, she's there to be a payoff.
She's not very good at dealing combat damage to a player
Multiple times.
Yeah.
So I think if you already have a payoff in the command zone, a reliable payoff that you always have access to, your deck should be full of enablers.
Yeah.
You want a ton of ninjas to be able to deal damage, or you want big spells that you can flip off the top to do a ton of damage. All of those count as enablers as part of this plan.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot in terms of token decks because I think they're really easy. The plan's really easy there. Make a lot of tokens.
Right.
And then generally the next step is pump all the tokens. There's other ways to win with them, but
right.
So if your commander is some form of, hey, all your creatures get +X+X, then you know you've got that.
Right.
You don't really need that much more of it in your deck because generally you do that once in a game and that's the game. So most of your deck should be like, hey, make a lot of tokens.
Make a lot of tokens.
Because I don't have to find the other part. I got it in my command zone.
Right.
Now, flip it and say, oh, my commander makes the tokens. So my commander makes a lot of tokens. Now, depending on how it does it, you might need cards that like trigger it to make the tokens. But let's just say there was a commander and all it did was just like every turn make 5 tokens. Well, you could have a lot of Crater Hoofs in your deck, a lot more. You still wouldn't want it all to be, because that's the key piece you're going to need to find. So I would think about it in those terms as well.
Yeah, so like if we consider a Yuriko a payoff, then you're like, okay, then I'll have as many enablers as I can to make sure my commander is working as well as possible. But you probably don't need a lot of payoffs because I know the payoff.
Yeah.
It's Yuriko.
Yeah.
So you maybe have like 2 payoffs that are like ninjas get +2/+2 or something like that. But you don't need a ton of them because the payoff is your commander. Okay, so let's talk about a commander that's an enabler. So this is the commander that is the plan.
Yeah.
The first one I thought of was Kalia of the Vast.
Okay.
It's like the plan is get Kalia on the battlefield, attack, and put a demon into play.
Right.
So she is the reason that the plan works is that you have Kalia. So I think you want a decent amount of enablers still because you want to make sure that like your commander's working as well as possible. This is where you probably want a lot of protection spells go part of this plan, especially
Haste.
for Kalia. Haste enablers, like Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots to give her hexproof, even just targeted protection type of spells is just make the Kalia plan work.
If she ain't attacking,
The plan's not going.
The plan's not happening. Yeah, exactly.
And then you have this enabler, you have so much in the command zone that you can have a little bit more on the payoff end, and that's your big demons, right? You can probably have, like, let's say you have, I don't know, 8 to 10 actual enablers. Then you can have, I don't know, 15 to 18, like, big demons that you can cheat into the battlefield because you want to reliably have them.
But you don't want 4 in your hand.
You don't want 4 because they're really expensive.
Yeah.
And then, your enhancers are like, my demons get more, I guess. But most of the time in this deck, you just want to be careful with how many of the demons you actually have. You're like, 18 will give me reliably 1, maybe 2, so if I can attack multiple times. But I want lots of ways to make sure the plan is actually happening.
Yeah.
Your enablers are often going to be the highest category, sort of regardless of what is in the command zone, because you have to make sure the plan's working.
Right. Yeah. That is your plan. And it almost can't be if it's not the main thing you're doing.
Right. Finally, what if your commander is an enhancer?
Right.
The big one I think of is Ishin. Whenever you attack, that triggers twice.
Right.
So you need a lot of enablers. You need a lot of things that say, when I attack,
Do something.
this happens.
Yeah.
Or creatures that can attack. But more likely you have creatures with attack triggers to be doubled by your commander. And you already have this like enhancer / payoff in the command zone. So you don't need to worry as much about the payoffs or the enhancers.
Yeah.
Because I have the way to multiply this. I just need the thing to multiply. And you're already dealing damage. So like, how many times do you need to multiply it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you're almost like, if that's working, you're working.
Yeah.
And if you have too much of that, you're not working. And so you want to err definitely on the side of like, yeah, I'm already attacking in combat damage or combat attack triggers. Cool. Now let's just do that twice as much.
Right.
That's way better than I want to do it twice as much. You're not doing anything. You're doing twice as much as 0. Oh.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you just want as many enablers as possible. If you have an enhancer in the command zone like Teysa Karlov, if that's your commander, you want 25 dice triggers at least.
Yeah, I think it's still okay to have like another force multiplier or 2, but you definitely don't want a lot,
right?
Because it's a win more type of deal.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I find it really helpful when you've got your pile of, the fun stuff and you're looking at it and you're like, okay, what role is this in?
Yeah.
Is this on the main plan or is this in the, payoff part or is this in the enhancer part? Because in general, enhancers is, once you identify, you'll find, I way too much an enhancer every time.
Mm-hmm.
Like as I pull cards, just not thinking about it, this one will be good, this will be good. Oh my gosh, if I Scryfall this one phrase, I get like these 10 cards and da-da-da-da-da, and then you lay them out and you go, okay, well, the enhancer portion, if you just think about it that way, will always be too big. And you're like, okay, cool. I really can only choose like the best 4 of these maybe.
I think this is the most common in like Spellslinger decks, where there's so many cool enhancers and payoffs for spells that are whenever I cast a spell, I draw 2 cards and I make a dragon and all of my stuff gets bigger. And you're like, if I draw a spell,
yeah, that's the thing.
It's going to be really bad.
Yeah, exactly. You're not casting spells though because you have only things that say when you cast spell do this. And it's like you just need if you don't have 25 or 30 instants and sorceries in your deck, it just won't work. So you just have to be at that minimal amount. And then that tells you, like, I really can only have, like, these 4 or 5 enhancers, and the rest of the stuff's got to be payoffs. Otherwise, my deck just will not do it. It just won't go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So those are the things that go into the deck. We're pretty vague about the plan because it varies so much, but just keep an eye on what role your commander is playing and how you can balance that with the remaining cards in your deck.
Think about if somebody said, what does your deck do? What's the log line of it that you could tell them? It gains life and it weaponizes that life gain to kill you.
Right.
Okay, fine. Great. Oh, it makes tokens and then I sacrifice the tokens for value. Cool. Yeah. Oh, it casts a lot of instants and sorceries and then I do some sort of like storm off or whatever. Or maybe just it multiplies the amount I'm casting the instants and sorceries. That could be the answer. Like
it could be a copy spell.
Yeah, exactly. I cast a lot of instants and sorceries can be the entirety of the plan.
All right.
I want to say that's the good thing about creature-related strategies too. Like in the token, people love tokens. I do too. And one of the reasons token strategies are so good is because the first part of the plan, make a lot of creatures, doesn't always need a second part of plan.
Make a lot of creatures.
You make a lot of creatures will also win you the game. So
keep making more.
Yeah, guess what?
Goblins.
That's pretty good. They attack and block. So yeah,
make them a little bigger.
Yeah,
like that's.
And then there's no and then. That's all I do. It'll win. Okay, that is possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I made a joke about it, but when Heir Apparent was printed, I was like, you could put 60 of these in the deck.
It just does the thing.
It wouldn't be a great deck because if you get board wiped, you kind of get blown out. But like the more you have, the better they are. You make a ton, that's enough.
Yeah. It might be a little boring to play.
But to each their own. The second element of building a deck is the mana curve. So this is like how many of each mana value you can put in your deck to have it be functional, to have something to do on turn 1, on turn 2, on turn 3.
To avoid that Kalia problem where you have like 4, 7, or 8 drops just stranded in your hand. And you have cards, but you're not doing anything because you can't cast them.
To do this, I was like, I'm not really sure what a modern mana curve looks like. So I took the averages from my decks and just pulled them so we can have a conversation about them.
Okay.
So I wanted to go through each mana value starting with 0. For me, I'm very low on the 0 end. I only have 0.22 cards per deck, which means like I have a few decks that have 1. This gets higher if you play at higher higher power levels where you play Lotus Petals and that kind of thing. I don't tend to, so a lot of my 0 drops are like X spells. It's like Walking Ballistas, that kind of thing.
Yep.
So this isn't super popular in casual Commander, and you don't really need to worry about having 0 drops. The next category is 1 drops. I averaged 9 1 drops per deck.
Yeah, I feel like that number's been going up and up over the years.
I agree.
So 10% of your deck almost, and really, what is that, like 12.5% of your actual non-lands?
Right.
So...
And it's like this section is mostly made up of
11%, I guess, sorry.
Ramp spells and targeted disruption spells. Is what mostly my 1 drops were. There's a couple of creatures in there. There's a couple of like special case draw spells that are 1 drops.
Soul Ring, Skull Clamp, like
Swords to Plowshares, that kind of thing. If they're 1 drops, they're probably very powerful in our format. So
I like to have 1 drops, and when I look at my deck's like original build and my 1 drop slot is low, I will consciously be like, what 1 drops can I even justify playing? I want a certain amount.
Yeah, and I was looking at like my lists and there's certain decks that have 15 1-drops. I have a deck with 24 1-drops. And it very much depends on like what my mana value of my commander is, how I'm ramping things out, or even what colors I'm in. I feel like I'm in white, I'm playing a lot of 1-drops. Where if I'm playing like black or red, I'm playing fewer 1-drops. But this makes up a bulk of your curve these days. The next category at 2 is the highest for me at 18.48 2-drops per deck. This is top of the bell curve. I always have the most 2-drops, whether it's 2-mana ramp or just 2-mana creatures that can carry swords, or 2-mana equipment that are great enhancers or enablers for my strategy. 2-mana is sort of the name of the game these days. Like, we've talked a lot about 2-mana 2/1 flyers.
Yeah, I think maybe 5 years ago, 2 and 3 were pretty close, but I think 2 was still probably ahead. But this is trending towards 2s and 1s. And we've talked about this before. It's always going to trend lower just because you're always going to... And the easiest swap in your deck is, this creature and this creature are very similar. This new one they came out with, but this one costs 1 less mana.
Yeah.
So I'll just swap it. And 2-drops because of 2-mana ramp, I believe, also just naturally kind of is, it's bolstered by a whole category that's its own thing, that most of your ramp is going to go there. We want 10, maybe 12 pieces. And there's a lot of decks where every single one of those 10 pieces is 2 mana, but at the very least, 80% of it is usually going to be in there. So that's probably one of the reasons it's also kind of like the highest category. But if you look at your curve and your 2-drop slot is not your highest, there's very likely that's not correct.
There's probably a way to lower it or to rearrange some things. I was just looking at my decks to see if there was any decks where I had more 3-drops or more 3-drops than 2s.
I would assume would be more probable than more 3s.
It looks like I have a couple of like weird ones, but I think of this deck, like 25 decks, 20 whereas 2 is the highest, and in 2 of those, 1 is the highest. I have a Karuga deck that requires 3 to be the highest, so it is a little bit of a weird one. But the fact that 2 makes up the bulk of your curve these days says that like a lot of what we're doing is casting 2-2-drops. So getting like a lot of my decks will be turn 2, you play some kind of 2-mana rock, and then turn 3, you play 2-2-drops.
Yep.
Or you play your 4-mana commander and then a 2-drop and a 3-drop. Because that's sort of the pace of commander now, is play multiple cards in the first 4 turns.
It's one of the reasons I really try and have more 1-drops too, is because the more 2-drops I have, the more likely I am to want to play a 2-drop on 3, in which case I have that 1 mana left. So 3-drops kind of get pushed out by virtue of like turn 3, I often don't have a 3-drop, and I'd rather have another 1-drop in hand. And so just further cutting down on 3-drops kind of like, and balancing towards 1s and 2s just makes sense. And like you said, mana rock into 2-2-drops is also a really good thing. So yeah, we should talk about the 3-drop category, which is next, and the next highest.
It is.
Yeah. So you average 13.86 3-drops per deck.
I did. And this I feel like is just because there's so many powerful like setup permanents at 3.
Yeah.
Like this is your professional face breakers. This is a lot of your like card draw enchantments or your enchantresses, that kind of thing. 3 is like a big engine piece. I feel like 3 is when your plan really starts. Like 2 is a lot of your enablers and creatures that sort of make things work. But I feel like 3 is like where your deck gets really specific. But that is a huge drop off. Like 18.5 to just less than 14 is what is it? It's 1/20th of your deck, but that's more of your deck when you get rid of lands. Sorry guys, math not my strong suit.
It's 5% of your deck, but yeah, more than 5% when you say non-lands.
Yeah, so it's a big drop off once you get to 3, because if there's a lot of things that are 2 mana that just kind of do it better.
Yeah, and like I said, a few years ago, these numbers were a lot closer together, although I think 2 was still ahead.
Yeah.
What I find fascinating is coming up. Let's go to the 4-drop slot, which is you average 10.48.
Yes.
10 and a half 4-drops per deck or so.
It drops off even more after 3. And I think the 4-drops are still are comparable to the 3s. Like they're close-ish. Because of how big the 2-mana slot is, 4 just fits in better in the curve. When you have 2-mana ramp, you play a 4-drop on turn 3.
Yeah.
I think 4 just fits nicer than 3 does a lot of the time. But it's more expensive. So it's still dropping off. Again, like 4 is powerful engine permanents. These are usually big cards that when they hit the table, people go, oh no.
Yeah. Yeah. I think 4 is kind of the top. I find that I'm allergic to anything above 4, kind of.
Yeah.
And even 4, I don't want that many, but like, okay, at 4, if it's very powerful, I feel it's pretty safe to include.
Right.
But above 4, and we're going to see this in the numbers,
Uh-huh.
it falls off dramatically, and I really feel this in deck building. I think my numbers would look similar to yours. So for 5 drops, you averaged 4.39. So a huge drop off between, 4 and 5.
That was
less than
wild
half
to
the
me.
amount. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's like, I feel that. I think 5 is an awkward mana value. It feels expensive, but it's not as powerful as like a 6 drop or a 7 drop because it's cheaper. So most of the time I'm just get stuck in this weird spot where it's like 5 just feels big and weird and doesn't fit. So when I have this 5 drop in my hand, I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. It's not it's not enough more powerful than like 4s that it feels worth it for that extra what you get.
Right.
But it's not because it's not powerful enough to match up with like 7s. I bet I have a bunch of decks where I have more 6s and 7s, or maybe even just more 7s than I do 5s and 6s. Like, yeah, 5 is just at this awkward spot. And I don't want them to design 5 mana cards to be as powerful as 7 mana cards. I don't think that's an answer. It's just sort of the natural outcome of like, the power creeping down towards the lower mana costs.
I was looking at my 5s because I was very curious to see like what 5s were making the cut, and they tend to be very, very powerful cards, or they tend to be very flexible effects. Like I still play Mystic Confluence, and I like it. I like it a lot because it just does what I need it to do. It either gives me cards, or it bounces a thing, or it counters a spell. I just feel safe behind it.
Yeah,
and it's often that kind of spell that's just like. It just does what I need it to do in the moment.
And it's an instant, so you don't deploy it and cross your fingers.
Right. They definitely don't tend to be permanents at 5.
Yeah.
In at least in my decks. And you get in this weird situation where you just prefer 4 drops or you prefer 7, 6 drops, certainly. I think 6 is like a big power threshold where they're like, if it's 6, it's fine. It's staying out of other formats. So they like worry more about 5 drops than they do about 6 drops. So once I actually looked at my numbers, I was like, I'm only playing 3.09 6 drops per deck.
But the 5s and the 6s are very close.
They're so close.
Yeah. And I feel that they aren't that different.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons maybe we're also shying away from 5s and 6s, and this is sort of, we did that episode recently about the In the 99 where we talked about the Wizened Mentor, and we kind of looked at like, oh, how many times would this have activated on the average game nights or whatever? We broke it down. And in there, you actually get less tokens on like turn 5 and 6. And we posited the theory, we don't know for sure, that more board wipes happen around turn 5 and 6, which would wipe the board and make people less likely to trigger the Wizened Mentor. Well, that would also line up with the fact that like I want to play less 5s and 6s because the last thing I want to do in the face of the turns where the board wipes are the most possible to happen is just spend all my mana on one big thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, hey, it's going to be a creature, and if it just dies to the board wipe, I'd rather have played a couple of things, and maybe one was an enchantment and one was this, or played a thing and held up my interaction, and then I lose left to the board wipe. Like, it just feels so much better on those turns when board wipes are likely to happen to not stick my neck all the way out.
Yeah, I would much rather play a 4-drop and hold up Heroic Intervention on turn 5 than I would just play a 5-drop creature and pass.
Yeah, almost no matter how powerful it is.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing. When I was looking at what kind of 6 drops I play, they're, again, flexible and big, like board wipes for the most part. It's like 6 in particular is my austere commands or my one-sided board wipes or something that starts to break the parity of the game, where it's like austere command, I'll blow up your board but keep my board, where I'll just handle the artifacts and enchantments at the table. It's the big modal spells is where 6 tends to live. Like 6 mana permanents, unless I have a way that I am cheating them into play or reducing the casting cost or reanimating them, I don't tend to put in my decks anymore.
Yeah, I'm absolutely the same.
Unless they're win cons. which is also 6 is where win cons start to get. So that's like your porcelain galleries, and we start to talk about crater hoofs, and like your big finishers is where 6 mana lives as well.
Yeah, and then we would see that in 7 drops you average 1.65 per deck, which is a little more than half as many of the 6s. But that's 7s and above. I would definitely say like most of those are like haymaker style cards,
right?
Where it's like either this card has the potential to win the game on the spot, or it will create such incremental advantage that I'm going to be hard to overcome, and feels safe in the way that like I get something now. Like when I play this, something happens where even if they get rid of it, I still kind of came out ahead.
Yeah, 7 mana is where like sort of the flexibility for me for my stuff stopped, and where the win cons really began. They were just haymakers, where it's like if I cast this, the game is over, or at least I'm going to try to make it over. And 8 drops and everything above that, of course, are the same. I averaged 1.27 8 drops in all of my decks, and the interesting thing is this includes Blasphemous Act,
which really shouldn't count as an 8 drop. Yeah,
which I didn't want to like adjust the stats to account for that, but like I think a lot of these ones are Blasphemous Act, or they're split spells like the Porcelain Gallery and Dollmaker's Shop that it's counting as 8.
Yeah, but fair enough. But X and 1 would go in the 1 drop slot according to this too.
Yeah, that's I didn't fudge. I didn't fudge the numbers all that much.
Really interesting, but not surprising to me. I don't look at any of this and be like, "Well, that's weird." It seems right in line with what my experiences have been, and the way my deck building has sort of been tending.
Yeah, I was looking at the decks that like ran even close to like 3 or 5 8 drops, and they're all Reanimator decks, or they're big ramp decks, or it's like Rakdos.
I'm not going to cast this stuff. I'm going to cheat it out. Yeah. And there are reasons to break that mold of this general mana curve, and you just need reasons to do it. Like, I can, I want more 6s and 5s in this deck because of this reason. That's totally fine.
I do want to mention that when I was doing stats for this mana curve, I pulled the extreme ones from it. Just I was like, Octavia runs 24 1 drops. I pulled the outliers. If you're looking at it and being like, well, if one of them has 10 8 drops, then that's messing up the whole thing. I did pull that out of the data before I made the averages. Okay, so that's the curve. I mean, the Commander curve template, it's not as exact, but to give you a general idea, is I run 9 1-cost spells, 18 2-cost, 15 3, 10 4-cost, 5 5-cost, 5 6+ cost spells. So anything that starts at 6 mana and goes up, I'm usually limited to only 5 there. 38 lands, 1 commander.
Unless it's a partner deck.
And then everything changes, which is the problem. If you haven't looked at your mana curve before, if that's not something you've considered, you can also do that on ARCHIDEKT. There's a thing in the top right corner. You just hit the stats button, and it pulls out a ton of data and gives you an idea for like what you're trending towards or where you're glutted. It's very helpful when you're like, I have a 4 mana commander, so maybe I need to cut down on my 4 drops. Or have a 5 mana commander and I need to like eliminate my 5 drops, so I'm always doing my commander on 5. It just gives you a better idea of what your deck looks like and how your game plan is going to play out.
Yeah, that tab is one of my favorite tabs.
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's the best. We did do an entire episode about mastering your mana curve. It is episode number 453. Again, that will be linked in the show notes, where we dive pretty deep. And mana curve does get a lot in the nuances of what your commander costs and other considerations, for sure. There's
a lot of things to think about, and your game plan. All right, so that's the template. That's where we're starting. We wanted to give you exact numbers. I watched a ton of these templates over the last week. I've watched probably 12 commander deck building templates. And
all they say is it depends.
And all of them are ranges.
Yeah.
And it was very frustrating to me because it was like some of them were very wide ranges where I was like, just tell me the answer. So I gave you the answer that I recommend. But the thing about that is it's a recommendation for the average deck. And in Commander, there just is no average deck. There's no average power level. There's no average strategy. And every deck has different strengths and different weaknesses, different wants and desires and payoffs. So
every playgroup is different.
Every playgroup is different. So a lot of this is just like, here's where you start.
Yep.
And the big thing about using this template accurately, I think, is just reading how your deck feels and starting to, when you're playing, recognize when you're not enjoying what your deck is doing and why you're not enjoying it. Are you missing land drops? Do you not have the choices you want? Are you getting run over by a certain kind of deck? And taking note of that so you can adjust it in your deck building process. Because once you've built a deck, that's only the beginning.
Yeah.
Once it's in paper, a deck can change and morph, grow, and improve, and it won't improve by spending more time sitting in front of your computer just moving cards around in different tabs. You do have to actually play it.
Although goldfishing will get you pretty far, so don't skip that part of the process as well. But yeah, I love that. A good example of this is, let's say you're building that Aristocrats deck, and we know that the main plan is like, I need to get creatures and be sacrificing them.
Yeah.
It's very common to just find like, man, I'm having trouble being able to sacrifice them. Oh, I need more sacrifice outlets. Like just paying attention to that kind of voice in your head of like, what am I noticing? I'm noticing I'm not hitting my land drops. I need more lands, or I need more draw, or both. Oh, I'm noticing that I'm noticing I have 3 sack outlets and I just don't have enough creatures to sack to them. Well, I probably need to recalibrate that balance. A little more things that make creatures or tokens and a little fewer sacrifice outlets, maybe. But you do that over the course of many, many goldfishes and multiple games. But pay attention to the voices in your head. But I love this because if you start, I think, with this template and just hit these numbers on the dot, you will have a functional deck.
Yeah.
This deck will work. It'll be, decent. It'll play. And then from there, that is where you start to listen to those voices and make the changes.
Yeah.
So, yeah. As a jumping off point, I think this is great.
And trust yourself.
Yeah.
Like if something feels off and wrong, if you're like, I don't need this much ramp or I don't need this many lands, maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. Like my Octavia deck runs 24 1-drops and 1 ramp card. Because it runs 24 1-drops, it doesn't need to ramp.
Right.
That's
I would
not
say
the plan.
trust yourself after you've played it, though.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is like when you're playing, you take these notes and you can make these adjustments as you go.
Yeah, but if you're a new deck builder, trust Rachel.
Yeah.
And build your deck with these numbers. And then from playing, trust yourself from there.
Right.
But I don't want you to, while you're building the deck, especially if you're a new deck builder, be like, I probably don't need that much ramp. You probably do. Let's listen to Rachel first. She's pretty good at this.
You should start here.
And then adjust from there based on play.
This is it's a very complicated issue because like the template is, you should try it and hit these numbers if you don't know what you're doing. But there's a lot of nuances that we've already started to mention, and there's a lot of problems and complications with having a deck building template at all. So we're actually going to do a partner episode to this one that talks about the complications of using a deck building template and how to make decisions for yourself if you're like, I know this isn't templated, and I'm a little bit more of an advanced deck builder, but I don't necessarily know how to inform my decisions in a way that I'm confident. So we have this episode to get you started building, and then we're going to have an episode come out next week to talk about all of the different ways to start ignoring the template if you're ready to do that. But most of you aren't. You should be running 38 lands.
There's that famous saying, you have to know the rules in order to break them. This is the Know the Rules episode. The next one is when to break them.
I swear, every time somebody sends me a deck list, they're like, my deck isn't working. What's wrong? It's like, you need more lands.
Yeah.
Every single time. And it's so condescending, but it's like, you definitely do.
Yeah.
That is the first thing I do.
You have 31.
Then play it.
Yeah, exactly. Everything will just be better if you just could cast more stuff. I promise you.
Magic doesn't. It's like, why isn't my car running? You don't have any gas in it.
Yeah, exactly. The problem is when they argue with you and you're like, listen, there's no gas in the car. There's no arguing with that. It doesn't work.
There's some.
Yeah.
No, there isn't. When was the last time you changed the oil? To the listeners, did any of these numbers surprise you? And how would you adjust the templates to suit your needs? Or do you have any questions about how we got to this data? Put them in the comments below. We know this is going to be an episode that people use for years, so hopefully it was valuable to you. If you haven't used a deck building template before, try it. Try it. There's a reason there's a template. It's where we start on every deck we build for game nights. It's where we start for every deck we build for Game Nights Live. We start with a place that we know is functional so that when we play it, the deck works. So hopefully it's made you a more confident deck builder, and we appreciate you watching.
Yeah. Well, thanks for putting this together, Rachel. I know it's going to help many people for years to come.
Hopefully.
All right.
38.
38 lands. If you take one thing away from this episode, 38 lands. I gotta tell myself that. I gotta look in the mirror. Yeah. All right. Before we go, if you want to build any new decks, well, you're gonna need cards for those decks. And the best place to get Magic cards is cardkingdom.com/commands. They have everything you're looking for because they are one big retailer. They have all the versions, the conditions, the cards you want. And the best thing about them is when you add all those cards to your cart and you check out, it all shows up on your doorstep in one convenient package. No waiting for a bunch of different envelopes from different places to get there. You can play your deck right away. You just got to sleeve it up and you are ready to go. They are also the most professional in the business. If there are any problems or issues, they solve it right away. We use them for all of our content, all kinds of stuff here. And we can't give any better endorsement than that, right? Like this Card Kingdom, we actually use them. So cardkingdom.com/command.
Once those cards are in your hand, you need to protect them, keep them organized, make them look cool. Go to ultrapro.com/command for high quality Magic accessories. They've got playmats from the latest set that you love. They've got deck boxes to keep your cards safe when you travel. They've got sleeves and card sorting trays. If you're like me and you've got piles of cards all over your house, I swear the card sorter will change your life. It's how I know where like half of my cards are. I'm like, oh, that's the pile from that draft. Okay, give me that.
That's
and
the difference between you and me. I don't know where any of my cards are. I need a card sorter.
See? Yeah, and pick up their Mana 8 line. Again, go to ultrapro.com/command.
Oh, yeah, they have those playmat displays as well, too. So if you get like a Mana 8 playmat, and it's really great. Everybody can sign it, and then they have the way to display it on your wall, which is really, really cool. So
it's cool.
Yeah, super fun. All right, before we go, big thanks to our amazing team here at the Command Zone: Rachel Kendra, Karina Cruz, Sebastian Salazar, Gaurav Galati, Jamie Block, Jordan Pridgeon, Jake Boss, Eric Lim, Josh Murphy, Manson Lung, Christopher Batista, Evan Limburger, Sam Waldo, and of course, the ineffable Jimmy Wong.
38 lands!
Whoa.
38.
Okay, don't. Otherwise, she's going to get mad. 38.
No, I mean it.
Okay, I promise. I
you
will.
can cut cards later.
All right, I'm going to go add 2 lands in my game night stack, by the way.